Hi, I'm John Phillips, DCI's Judge Administrator. Today has been our third anniversary of the DCI Judge Training broadcast. I was joined by our Judge Administration team and, of course, DCI's Artistic Director, Michael J. Cesario.
The J got in there this time. Thank you, John. One of the things that John and I decided was that you, the program coordinators, would be able to see some of what we talk about with the judges. So much of it pertains directly to your programs and the way you're presenting things that we wanted to make sure you were hearing some of the same things the judges were hearing. So we have a few segments, not the whole day, but a few segments that we thought we'd let you in on and make sure you understood how your voice in all of this, the Rules and Systems Task Force, affects what we do and what we speak of and how we interpret things. So I'm going to guess we'll show you a lot about general effect and what we talked about in general effect. This is a year in which there are no new rules, so it's just a refreshed stability. Next year, for 2018, remember we're in a rules congress, so this is the time to start thinking about what we want in terms of systems and what we want in terms of rules so that you're ready to go when it comes to January. There are September deadlines for whenever rules proposals are due in, and your director can fill you in on all of those. What we wanted to do, however, with this was come directly to you. We also have a great bit of good news, which is while I have been able to be a catalyst for change, I think we're going to have a great catalyst for the future in Lee Carlson as our new artistic director. So as you see us on the road, be sure to say hi and let him know how enthused you are by this. So without any other thing to say really, except here's a few clips from today's training session that we thought you'd enjoy. What we're going to talk about now is general effect, and we're going to talk about the creative and the critical thinking about design. So that's what's going to go up on the screen at this point, and that'll come up with both me and then later you're going to get Dr. Nola Jones, who has a really terrific presentation to put together. So let's start talking about general effect, and here we go. One of the things that we talk about with GE is our ability, first of all, to perceive it. We have to be able to recognize, to be cognizant of what elements are going together at any given time, how it's being developed, how it's all being put together. But this isn't an analytical approach. This is not about analyzing it. That's for the ensemble people, the analysis people. What's really important is that we see it and we respond to it. We are affected by it. And then when we are affected by it, for goodness sakes, reward it. So let me go through a few things that I think we may not be rewarding as much as we should, and elements that I'm going to expect you to reward this summer. First, drill. Reward it. The course, get some. It's important. Now let's be clear about this. When we talk about GE, I was reading this great biography piece on Jimmy Webb, the composer. And when they said, what's the effect you want when you play it for somebody for the first time, whatever, he said, I look at them while I'm playing, I want to see their anti-gravity set in. And I think that that's what we're looking for. We're looking for their anti-gravity to kick in. We want that crowd to be lifted as one. What Bernstein called the transformational moment, when we take a group and the communication is so strong, the effect so strong, that the performers and the audience are one. To do that, when we see drill, first of all, large choreographic forms with motion and variety and motivation, and also pictorial integrity. Why is it moving that way? What's the motivation for it? Sounds analytical, but we're going to enjoy that it seems to be moved like a river, or it seems to move like a squadron of men, whatever it is. And then pictorial integrity. Don't forget, when they stop, it shouldn't look like you're simply forming the outlines of every state in the Union. It's important also because drill is one of the few things we do better than anybody else. It's part of the magic of drum corps and part of our priceless cultural heritage. It fills the field in a way that nothing else can. And we are looking for the scale and the scope, cinemascope, of the full 100 yards. Where we can and where we do, let's by all means reward it. The program coordinators are finding ways to integrate many different forms of staging and promoting the voices by staging them differently. But we must be constantly aware that it should not look like a bunch of kids waiting for a bus. It's time to make sure that we see how things are developed into and out of forms, that the forms have an integrity of their own, that there's a reason why those forms are there, because that's what builds great drill. We expect to see this make sense, and I'm going to be looking for return to it. For those who say, isn't that a little bit passé? I say, get rid of the rifles and the sabers, and we'll talk about getting rid of drill. General effect is, again, about recognizing, responding, and reward. So we're going to talk about drill reward. We're also going to talk about stillness. Many of us reward and recognize opposing qualities, don't we? Rough to smooth, loose to loud to soft, bound to free. Do not rewrite their shows. That's not our job. Our job is not to suggest stuff. So let's avoid the cliche that I've heard on way too many tapes last year, which is, maybe you should do a little something under that. First time I hear it this year, pack your bags. You're off the tour. It's not ours to suggest what they should or should not be doing under a moment, especially considering that most of the time they're doing it because you said. There are ways to ask for layering. There's ways of saying this may be too simplistic, but telling them to add, you can't see it right now, but I am doing one hell of a plie under this table. It doesn't affect how I'm talking. It's important that you understand it's not your job to suggest it, and that in fact they understand that they shouldn't fill every moment with nonsensical movement, lunges and rond de jambes, just because they feel they have to do it. No, we've got to fill every moment with movement. No. Stillness is, in fact, one of the great qualities. If you talk about great acting, you'll see that the great actors are able to almost do nothing. Nothing with their face, nothing with their hands, nothing with their eyes. And you can almost see them think. We have to be aware that if we're going to talk about developing ideas, we have to, in some cases, start from nothing. And that way, when we build up to 220 beats per minute, backwards and upside down, playing with our feet, it becomes an effect because we started with zero. Many of you taught music, and you know that when we sit down to teach a young child to play, one of the things we first insist on is that the rest is as important as the note. So is it here. That time of, and it might be a very quiet or beautiful moment, or it might be the blow my face off moment. And you've got to give us that big drum corps thing that is not impeded by some sort of faux artistry. Let's be sure that no matter what, we can see the development of the idea and make it more compelling because of its juxtaposition to something non-moving. Let's move along. Development, reward. From one layer to another, from one idea to another, long extended, and specifically we need to allow long extended ideas. We've lengthened the shows to allow for more ideas. Even the mashups can now take their time a little bit so we understand that or hear that clever piece that's from something else because you've given us, the audience, the time to hear it. Remember that we are the most educated person in the audience, and so we may be used to it. We've done our research and so on. The audience itself has not. You may be responding, and the audience may not be. That may be a case where we have underdeveloped ideas, that we may have to take it to the limit again with our scale and scope. Sometimes we have to take that idea one notch up. Again, we're not in the winter. I think it's important that the growth from one level to another is rewarded, that we see it, that we hear it. It's a program. We want to be able to be sure we're creating programs that bring these ideas to fruition. And to do that, we need to take the time to do it. The course now have the time. I'm not suggesting 15-minute shows. I'm just suggesting that we hear ideas and see ideas move from one level to the other. Here's another melody. Oh yes, reward. And I'm not just talking about a motif repeated a couple of times to please the music analysis guys. It's time to give the audience something to take away in their pocket. It's something for them to sing on the way home. They need to soar on the wings of song. Or be violent and angry over that piece that you just jammed in their nose. I don't care which it is, but make sure they can go home singing it. Make sure that they understand how and where it comes from and why you used it. That's what I'm asking the chorus to do, and I'm going to ask you to be there to evaluate that and reward it when it shows up. It's hard to play melody. It's hard to develop that long phrase line. Visually, even harder. So here's a good time. When you hear it, when you see it, when you see visual melody, when you hear musical melody, it's time. Reward. Here's an old friend we haven't visited in a while. Rhythmic complexity. Reward. How is it that everything I'm hearing in the last 3-4 years is common time? It's 4/4. When you hear, whether it's 3 versus 6, America, something like that, or whether we get 5/4 bars, or there's all kinds of 7s going on, when you hear it and it's complicated, where you can't just go rat, tat, 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 they're working twice as hard to create that effect because it's not a natural for marching. It's not a natural for moving. It's intended to be a stutter step of some sort. By all means, when you see it, when you hear it, reward it, especially if we can see them doing something unique visually to an unusual rhythm. And remember that they're going to have a relationship with that rhythm. And like in everything else, like a relationship with a melody, you may work in opposition to it. I'm reminded of that great piece that Carol Abahatab did with the Santa Clara several years ago. And what is it? The Serenade for Strings. Thanks for the help. I've got a room full of people. Where the piece is angry but really sad, the barber. And Carol is working the anger against it. That in fact, nothing lined up beat and bar perfect. But in fact, the effect was devastating. And it's because she made the rhythms all the more complex by layering another rhythm on top. And that's a while ago. Here we go. Scale and scope. You knew this was coming. Reward. It's important that when we regard aesthetics and intellect, we have to remember, you've heard me say it, no real intellectuals are coming to the DCI shows. Nobody is reading Kierkegaard in between the chorus, missing the warm-ups. It's important we understand the context of our intellect, that we are bringing a higher level of thought to the programs that we're presenting on the field. Emotion is certainly part of it. We have to understand complexity of emotion, but all of this is done on a huge, monstrous stage. I'm expecting, with the sense of increased development, especially having heard what I've heard of the show so far, that they are really pushing the ability to add intellect and to emotion in a way that it fuses. And I'm looking forward to that. And we have to be able to recognize that they've mastered the size and scale. Whether it's that they send islands of people out, whether it's that they use the whole field all at once, whichever way it is, I don't care. I want to see us use the whole field, up and down. What can we do vertically? What can we do horizontally? Let's be sure we're with it. I almost want to say make your subtleties more obvious. There are other activities, and they have the ability to be played in a small arena. So what happens is you can read the buttons on a coat. You can read a sneer or a half smile, that kind of thing. I tend to think of these as kind of Sundance Film Festival, intimate portraits of intellectual detail. That's terrific. That ain't us. We're the summer blockbuster. We have to appeal to a large amount of people, not just moms and dads of the groups. And we have to get them in line, as Jimmy Webb said. You know, we want their anti-gravity to kick in. So it's important that we do this. Remember, something like the Ten Commandments or Star Wars are actually important subject matter. But in between time, they drown people or blow stuff up. We have to make sure that we're rewarding the blow stuff up when it works and rewarding the ability to reach as many people as possible. It sounds like I want to sell tickets. I want to sell tickets. We're here to produce summer blockbusters. As I say, Carmen or the Ten Commandments or Star Wars are all great indicators of the kind of heroism, the kind of detail that can be in our show. What we are is grand music on a grand scale. We have a stage larger than the Metropolitan Opera. Lastly, performance, reward. I know we have a lot of performance captions. I'm aware of it. They all have their moment in the sun. But when the performers are reaching you, when they are grabbing you by the throat, causing a strong reaction, you have to let the kids tell you who's winning that show. They will reach out and let you know when they're on the highest high of communication. It's just not smile on count 14. It's when they're breathing together, when the emotion is so strong, when the message is so overpowering that they reach every member of the audience. Also, when you see it and it's all you hope it could be, well, goodness sakes, give the points out. What do you care? I saw a show a few years back, and I looked at the judges, and 3 of the 4 GE judges were crying. And yet they didn't really where does crying fit into me rewarding people? And the answer was big. That's really hard to get that response. I've always said my ideal response is a standing crying ovation. Outside of Bette Midler, who'll be here later. She's the surprise guest. It's kind of hard to, no? Okay. It's kind of hard to define what that is, but you know it when you see it, don't you? It's very important that when they reach you, when the performers are doing theirs, and especially because we're insisting on this 100-yard stage, and you can watch some color guard girl come in from the back sideline, and she's in character. And if you followed her, not that you should on GE, but if you did, you'd see that that performance is living up to everything you could possibly wish for in that program. Reward it. Remember, you're only seeing tonight's show. It is not the amalgam of all the nights that have gone before it, not even the championships, nor is it a preview of what's to come. Reward tonight's show tonight. Now, let's move forward a little. So all we have to do from there on is remember that all these rewards are part and parcel of general effect. It's a bigger thing than all of us. Musicians, be aware of the subtleties, the nuances, and new opportunities for color, fabric, costume. Those are all in your venue. Don't assume because it's a ballad, blue would be a good color, although blue would be a fine color. Don't just presume it's that way. And visual folks, if that's your background, don't be afraid to say, this part of it gets me. That part where we have the very high voices. Nobody's going to insist that you understand exactly what that little repeating figure, the ostinato, is. We're not expecting you to use funny Italian words for the music. We're expecting you to respond. Recognize it, respond, and reward. Thanks. What we're going to do right now is we're going to take a quickie break to restage for the remainder of the GE discussion, but we will play the short pacing video that you saw earlier. You're supposed to have been able to see this already, but we'll do a little review as we set up the new thing. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Hi there, welcome to Extra Credits. My name is Daniel, I'll be doing the talking. This is James, he'll be doing the writing, and that over there is Allison, who's in charge of the pretty pictures. We are here to talk about these, and this week we want to talk about pacing. Take a look at this here chart. I don't know who made it, I found it years ago, and I haven't been able to find it again since, but this right here, this is pacing. Let's have a closer look. This graph represents an ideal example of pacing, provided by Star Wars A New Hope. The curve shows our engagement with the film at any given time. Let's start at the beginning. We kick things off with a big chase and battle sequence where Princess Leia is captured by the Empire. Nice, exciting start. You have my attention. Then things settle down a little as the stage is set and more of our characters are introduced. We meet Luke, Luke meets Obi-Wan, etc. But then we have a sudden spike in intensity as Luke's aunt and uncle are killed. And from there, the curve is a succession of peaks and valleys, slowly building the tension higher and higher and higher until we finally reach the most intense scene in the movie with Luke in the Death Star trench and that whole use the Force moment. Luke fires the torpedoes, the Death Star is destroyed, and the intensity settles down as the story resolves itself. Great example of pacing. Ask anyone who entertains, be they a rock star, a writer, a casino owner, or a sketch comedian, and they'll tell you that almost all good entertainment has a pacing curve that looks just like that. You want to hit it big in the beginning, get everybody tuned in and excited about what's going on, and then you want to give your audience a breather so you can set the right baseline for the experience. Your opener has to be short, otherwise the audience will expect too much, and they'll take your big intro as the baseline of excitement for your piece, creating an unreasonable expectation about the trajectory of your work. The first God of War is a great example. The opening Hydra fight grabbed you and made sure you weren't putting that game down anytime soon. But then they ramped back the epicness for a bit, so they could choose their moments and weren't forced to take everything to 11 halfway through the game just to keep your attention. Once you got your opener in place, then you need to oscillate that engagement level in a steadily increasing manner. Many young designers make the mistake of thinking that each moment in a game has to be bigger and better than the last. They think their game has to plot a straight line, constantly climbing higher, when in reality, that's actually kinda counterproductive. The thing is, human beings get acclimated to stimuli. Think of entertainment like candy. If you have candy every now and then, it tastes awesome. If you have it all the time, though, it starts only tasting okay, and before you know it, you have to turn to even more potent sugary treats to get that level of satisfaction. The player's overall enjoyment of your work will actually increase if you alternate between periods of intense engagement and periods of rest. If you want a crystal clear example of this, simply turn to the survival horror genre. In survival horror games, they use tension as the principal form of engagement. A good survival horror game will build the tension, scare you at the crescendo, and then release so they can build you up and scare you again. Bad survival horror games tend to do one of two things. They either A, constantly maintain a high level of tension so much that it becomes exhausting, or B, try to scare you all the time to the point that the scares end up becoming routine instead of shocking. Finally, you can't leave your audience at the most intense point of the experience. You have to bring them back down so they feel some closure. Otherwise, they'll feel as though the experience was truncated or ended abruptly. This is the very rule we break to create cliffhangers, but unless that's your objective, a well-crafted, holistic piece should spend a little bit of time at the end bringing the audience back to where they engage with the piece as a whole. If you get them hugely invested in what's going on in the final moments and then just cut to credits, you're only going to leave people frustrated. At this point, it's probably worth mentioning that this graph measures engagement of all sorts. Many games provide engagement through excitement or fun, but like I said with survival horror games, tension, satisfaction, curiosity, even sorrow can foster that engagement as well. And as a designer, you need to know what combination of emotions you're going to be using to understand how you're going to create this curve. Let's use the survival horror example again. Consider all the survival horror games that have been ruined because the designers didn't consider what type of engagement was appropriate for their game. Instead, because they were so used to delivering excitement and fun, they turned their game into another guns-blazing action fest and completely failed to deliver on any of the tension that's the cornerstone of the genre, leaving the game with a curve that looks nothing like the one we showed. So yeah, that's basically how pacing works. Simple enough. But what a lot of designers tend to not realize is that this graph doesn't just apply to the experience as a whole, it applies to every moment. When James is designing a game, he splits it into roughly 3 segments: the arc, the scene, and the action. The arc represents the piece as a whole. As we just discussed, you want the overall game to follow this sort of engagement curve. Just for an example, BioShock pulls this off fairly well. At least it does if you just imagine the game ends after that scene with Andrew Ryan. After that, it just kind of... yeah. Anyway, so that's the arc. The scene is a subsection of the game, what we would often call a level, though it can take other forms depending on the type of game you're playing. Each level, or building, or encounter in a game should follow the exact same engagement pattern. Dungeons in Oblivion, specific firefights in Halo, bosses from the early Final Fantasies, even the greatest levels in your favorite Mario game. 9 times out of 10, when you examine those scenes, you'll find you can plot them almost perfectly on the graph above. But this universal style of pacing extends one more layer down to the action. The action is a specific moment of player experience. It's frequently an aspect of the mechanics, often something as simple as a single player input. You ever play a shooter where the guns feel just right? Go back and you'll notice firing the gun fits on this curve. That bit of excitement as you begin to raise the gun, slight lull as you bring it to your mark, then bang, the shot, followed by a drift off as you bring the gun back to its resting position. It all happens in less than a second, but that second is divided up along those lines. That is the action. If the action doesn't share that curve, the game tends to feel stilted and just off somehow. This is one of the hardest things to achieve as a designer, but it's also the most important, because the action is what the player experiences the most directly. Think of this graph as a giant tessellation, and everywhere you zoom in, you'll find the same graph repeated in miniature. The 3 sections I've given, the arc, the scene, and the action, are just the 3 that James finds to be the most useful when creating a game. But if you go looking yourself, you should be able to find this graph everywhere. You want to make a well-paced game? Try to make sure it conforms to this graph in as broad and as granular a sense as possible. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
We're back. I'm here with Wayne Dillon and Richard Kent, our esteemed colleagues, and we're here to talk about General Effect today and the application. We're doing this a little bit differently. We hope you enjoy it. We invite you to send questions and comments throughout this discussion. We'd like for it to be as interactive as possible. So we're gonna ad lib. We've got we can queue up to certain sections in the video, as long as we know, and we can let Jeff's team know they're fabulous and very responsive. So we'll be able to queue up different places during this clip to be able to discuss those and dissect those. Quick review about the pacing video that you watched. We want to just briefly touch on that. The arc, the scene, and the action. The action being the moment, but the arc and the scene and the action all creating a tessellation effect, and if you will, an arc through time that should be looked at both in a broad and a granular sense. So if you'll just keep those things in mind: tension, satisfaction, sorrow, and fun. Maybe some words that are going to come to you as we watch this next clip. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the clip before we start. We intentionally didn't pick a movie clip that was strings while someone ran through a field of daisies.
That would have been nice.
That would have been nice, but that's not what this is. So the clip is from the movie Pan's Labyrinth that was put out in 2006. It received 3 Academy Awards, including, it was nominated for Best Soundtrack, obviously. I think you'll agree when you hear it. But it received the 3 Academy Awards for Art Direction, Cinematography, and Makeup, which you'll see a lot of that in this scene you're about to watch. It was also nominated for Best Score, Best Original Screenplay. So, but it's a scene from the movie. I'll set it up for you. Ophelia is our heroine. She has been tasked to go into the underworld, and you don't need to know the whole movie. It's set in 1944 after the Spanish Civil War, and it's an adult fairy tale. Can we say gruesome?
Oh, yes, we can say the grouping.
But it's meant to be something that maybe we're not as comfortable with in discussing in terms of effect. Some things I would ask you to think about and maybe jot a few notes while you're watching this clip. And if we need to go back and review little parts of it, we can. The sparseness of the actual soundtrack. There's melodic intent that Michael referred to earlier. If we watch the whole movie soundtrack is built around this poignant little melodic lullaby that's her theme throughout, and you'll hear little snippets of it. You may hear a little snippet of 2 notes of the Dies Irae that really connotates tension. Notice how he uses little sound bites that may not actually be music, but the parallel in terms of how our designers are now using sound clips and electronics to enhance the musical soundtrack. These are the kinds of things that we really would like to discuss when we go back and review after we review the video. So anything you want to add to that?
Just one of the things harmonically, I was taken with how it was orchestrated to match the tension in the scene, how they used the harmonies and the density and the harmony to create that.
And the orchestration of what voices are used where. I think if you'll pay really close attention to that, you'll be able to dig in and find some cool things. One thing to point out to you, the outer world where she starts, the realistic world, is meant to be angular and cold and dark. And the inner world, even though this is a journey and is fairly gruesome, it's meant to be warm and almost like inside the mother's womb. So that might be something that when you're looking at the use of light and dark and color, that you might look for that symbolism. Anything else you want to jump in terms of visual?
Don't close your eyes when you see the eyes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we're ready to watch it now, Jeff. Thank you. And we're back. I guess you're awake now, huh? So the most obvious question, the first thing to ask, and we're going to ask you to please send your responses to Lee. We've given you the prompt on the screen one more time if we could do that, to send your questions and answers to the questions that we're going to pose and comments, and we'll feed those to you as well. The first most obvious question is, what do you remember most from that scene? What's the one thing you remember? What do you remember the most?
Well, the first moment for me was her outlining with the chalk and then first looking into the hallway moment, and I was intrigued by the use of the string as sort of the strings as a singular unison. And as she pushed through and looked into the hallway, as the camera pulled back and you got the sense of the magnitude of the room, the brass came in and created this awesome sonority that we hadn't heard to that point.
Yeah, up to that point, it was like light strings and celeste and a real innocent sound to the soundtrack, very sparse. Yeah. What did you notice visually about the introduction of the use of color and in the opening statement?
Well, honestly, the first time I saw it, I thought it moved a little slow.
It does, yeah. I think that's intentional, right?
Well, and I'm going, get there already, okay?
Yeah.
Because there are some shows that, it takes a while to get there. But then, as it progressed, you kind of got drawn in to the whole scenario and her going and interacting with the little fairies and then the monster. I thought that it was very well put together. I liked the use of light and dark with her, and the warmth of the colors. And isn't that supposed to be hell too?
Yeah, actually, it's hell, but it's also meant to be the warmth of a mother's womb, meaning that she's trying to get back to the underworld. If you see the whole movie, when she's in the upper world, everything is cold and angular and dark, and it's meant to be warm when she goes into
The eyes thing just sent me over. I can't do roller coasters and I can't do eyes. Okay, and the first time I saw the eyes, that was it.
Yeah. So quickly send Lee your comments about what you think you most remember about the scene that you just watched, and then we'll get some feedback from you all. While you're doing that, let's speak to the arc in the scene of the movie, the entire 6 minutes, and how that related to the arc that our pacing video described in the Star Wars.
Definitely a sense of the initial, the one I mentioned, the one that struck me as the initial impact moment, and then it kind of came down a little bit. And it was interesting that Michael talked about stillness, and I thought that was effective. There were times where there wasn't any real sound, and it was about the action, and then it would start building up. One particular moment was in the strings, and when she was going towards the grapes and the fairies were trying to warn her, there was this ascending, like, chromatic idea that just kept going higher and higher. For me, I just felt that was building on the tension of what was happening in the scene.
Yeah, you would, her going for the grapes wouldn't have been nearly as impactful without the ascending of those strings and the little chirping, endearing
Right.
chirping of the fairies saying, no, don't do that, right? Yeah, either one of those.
And I thought in the beginning, they were taking long shots of the long hallway, and then as she moved into that room, and then when she started to take the grapes, then the pictures, the speed of the different shots kept going, building tension visually.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And that was
yeah.
hitting me right in the tummy. I'm
That-
going, get out of there already. Okay, take the knife and go, please.
Well, that was one of those, he talked about the arches and within the pacing, not doing a straight line
Right.
like sugar, because if you stay on that path, if you don't let it dip.
Right.
And so that when she got the knife and there was that release moment,
The moment where it breathes.
she could have started down that hallway. There was plenty of sand left in that hourglass, and we could have cut to the credits.
And I like how they kept going back to the hourglass to show you, to just reintroduce that theme that she's got
Right.
to get out of there.
Absolutely. So examples of tension and release, if you would send Lee some comments about examples of tension and release. Again, include any questions, Lee. Are we getting some responses?
Yeah, the mood shifts from the opening childlike music box orchestration to the full ensemble minor chord hits. This was a moment that went from safe to dangerous, in the most dramatic shift of emotional focus out of the whole scene.
Absolutely. And wow, if we can recognize that when we're watching drum
Yeah.
corps and really articulate the way that person just did, that's the example of looking at overall effect and how to really credit the design components and how well they're achieving it.
The other thing that struck me, Nola, was a really effective blending, a seamless blending of acoustic and electric sounds to create some new and effective timbres that I really think enhance the scene.
Right. And in doing some research about this clip from the scene, one of the things they talked about was the sparseness of the soundtrack and the intentionality of that. And that it was really important that these sound bites, like that scratching of those black nails, the cries when you saw the frescoes.
Yeah.
By the way, that was symbolism of the Holocaust, the piles of shoes. And of course, I think it's obvious that the grapes were the relationship of the orbs and the size of the grapes to the eyeballs, and that shocking
Be
moment.
doing eyeballs.
Yeah. You have another one, Lee?
Yeah. The use of the breathy sound effect as she entered the labyrinth, given life and a human quality to the new environment.
Absolutely. That's a great
Very
one.
good.
Uh,
And then how that increased the tension, the breathing, as she was when she realized that the monster was coming after her.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And just like in the real world, when we're judging drum corps, we have to remember these things. We have to take notes. We have to remember those so that we can discuss them later in our wrap-ups, but also later in critique. So we don't really have the chance to go back and watch it again. If you want to watch this clip again, it's on YouTube. We'll send you the clip. You can get to it. But let's go ahead with our conversation.
This is going to point you in the direction we talked about last night.
Can you guys hear the sirens?
The building blocks. It's the fairies.
The use of the sound effects to provide connection to the environment was remarkable.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't get on the first or second viewing even was the crackling of the fire as she walked down the banquet table from which she was not allowed to eat. And just that crackling of the fire behind that, it connotated warmth, but it was also very foreboding as well. For me. So can we talk about examples of tension and release? We talked about the knife. We talked about the fairies telling her no, no, no.
Yeah.
And then when the black nails scratch on the table the very first time, it's like he's just toying with us throughout all that. If you'll send in maybe some other examples, we don't want to say all of those, but maybe you could send in some examples of tension and release. How about specific sound effects that might not be actually music? We talked about the fairy chirping, we talked about the fire crackling. What are some other ones that we noticed?
The chair bouncing when she was trying to draw the second. I'm going, draw the stupid door, okay? And you had her running, and then you had the monster, and they showed both feet. I like the contrasts in that as well.
Going back and forth, yeah.
The opening of the doorway
Yeah.
both times into the ceiling and the initial shot, that specific sound.
And when it slams down finally at the end, and you still hear the monster in the background screaming, but that finality of that slam down at the very end, and how that kind of brings us down back into a point of being safe again. You're looking at me, you have another one?
Well, I think your opportunity to connect the sound that the fairies are creating to what we do on the field with the amplifications and the sound effects that the cores are creating.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that fairy character without the little chirping sound, that endearing insect, like it was modeled after the praying mantis was what they modeled that. Guillermo del Toro is fascinated by the praying mantis, and so they modeled. But a praying mantis doesn't make that chirping sound. They added the chirping sound to the character. Can we switch gears a little bit now and let's talk about the actual characterization and role play? Let's get to the right side of the sheet and talk about how effective they were in communicating those.
I thought the female character was very believable, drew you in, and was just central to creating that tension. Very believable.
There was a naivety about her in that she read the whole story at the beginning, the introduction. But when the fairy said go to that center door for the knife, she said, no, I'm going to this one. And then she's shooing them. I mean, so she kind of went back and forth between, yeah. How about the pale man?
He looked like that, where they do the layered of skins, that whole thing. That was really strong. And you know, just seeing it sitting there motionless was scary enough. But then when it came back to life, you know, how the nails went and started, and then when he was doing the mask with his eyes, again, very good, very simplistic, you know, because he had the eyeballs in his hands. But it gave a great great mask impression when he put the hands up by the eyes.
Yeah, just the character itself was frightening, but the delivery of it as well certainly magnified that. Did you notice that the extended brass quality, brass ideas were related to that character? Not to hers, obviously, but that it's you have. I watched it several times to really pick that you didn't get extended brass interaction until that he had come alive, so to speak.
And an increase in the harmonic picture.
Density.
Become more dense, and again, towards the character portrayal, but also creating the tension.
You know, we had a question during the break, Wayne, where someone asked about the relationship of total clarity versus non-clarity and how that affects effect. Is that something that we really want in terms of rewarding effect, is total clarity?
Absolutely. I mean, I could think even just in some of the examples that you talked about, the fact that we were still hearing musical ideas, that you could still perceive the tension, you could still hear the fairies, and all of that was happening simultaneously, seamlessly, to create the effect.
So while the scoring can be really, really dense in terms of harmonic language, and that's intentional, the dissonance, the chromatic, you know, that dissonance, and it's very thickly scored
Inside
of it.
the clarity.
But the clarity of musical intent is obvious for us in order for us to reward. Is that a sufficient answer, do you think?
I think so.
Yeah. Lee, how
This is just a reaction. I'm struck by the synergistic nature of visual and audio. It speaks to our holistic approach to effect and how each element enhances the other and the whole. The final emotional journey was something that did not exist in parts alone, but rather an additional layer that stood atop all of the other layers.
I think that's a fabulous wrap.
Pretty much
Whoever-
it.
Thank you.
That says it all.
Yeah.
So I think that we're pretty much to the conclusion of this section. You'll be able to access the pacing. You have the pacing video that you can review at any time, and we'll send you the link to this video. It's up online on YouTube. You can actually watch the whole movie if you choose to do that. But we thank you for your comments. Is there anything else you?
There's a lot of really good comments on here, and we'll try to figure out some way to allow everybody to see what everybody else is talking about, because there's some really good stuff.
Yeah. And we'll just do a wrap up and email that to everyone.
Yeah.
So if you want to watch it again and review that.
And
look
thank
at
you
what
guys for
everybody
so
else
much
is doing.
interaction. This is great.
This was not about the scoring part of this. The next section we'll delve more into that. But this was about getting us to think holistically about effect, how we use those devices. You don't go in and overanalyze, but you do dig deeper into noticing what components are used to generate the effect and how successful they are. So we hope you have a great drum corps season, and here's to everyone's presentations as being effective as the one we just watched.